Hey class, welcome back. And today we are going to get into chapter 22. And in chapter 22, we are going to be focusing on World War II. So let's begin. So our key terms for today, we are going to be focusing on the buildup of fascist governments throughout the world. So we're actually going to scope out of U.S. history a little bit and go a little bit into some world history. So we're going to focus on the rise of fascism in Italy, Japan, and Germany. And then we're going to talk about the U.S. reaction to the rise of fascism in Europe throughout the 1930s. And then we're going to talk about the beginning of World War II. So before we get started today, we are going to define fascism. What is fascism? We hear this word get thrown about a lot, and so it's important to understand what we mean when we say fascism. So fascist governments arise in the wake of World War I. And the most classic examples of fascist governments come from Italy, Germany, and also Japan to a certain extent. Japan more militaristic than fascist, but still very much along the same lines as fascist governments. So the definition of fascism, again, sort of textbook definition here, is a government system led by a dictator having complete power. So this particular dictator is going to really feed off of this sort of cult of personality. They are going to depict themselves as a savior to the people, part of the strong sort of persuasive messaging of fascism is that people have somehow been victimized. And so this dictator comes along, and this dictator is supposed to somehow lift the population, lift the country out of its suffering. And so that's the role of the dictator. Now, this dictator has full and complete power. And in a fascist government system, there is a forceful suppression of any kind of opposition and criticism. So, for example, media is highly censored in fascist government systems. Any kind of entertainment is highly censored in fascist government systems. If you speak out against a fascist government, you could be imprisoned, you could be killed, you could be exiled, right? So there is a dictator forcefully oppressing criticism and opposition. The other main characteristic of a fascist government is the regimentation of industry. Now, this is not necessarily the type of regimenting of industry that you might see in a communist or socialist government. In fact, in a fascist government, private industry is highly valued. So there is a promotion of private industry, but that private industry must meet the needs of the state. So, in other words, you could have a private industry in a fascist government, but that private industry has a partnership with the government, and that partnership is going to further the needs of the state. The ultimate economic goal of any fascist state is to be completely economically independent. Right? There is also a heavy emphasis on building up military within a fascist state. The whole idea is that there is this sort of beauty in the Darwinian struggle of violence and will, and it's very much tied also with this next point, which is this emphasis on an aggressive nationalism, which is often referred to as ultra-nationalism. This is this idea that somehow there are these racially pure people, that somehow the people of this particular area or ethnicity are somehow superior to others. So there's this strong element of what we call ultranationalism, which is basically a form of racism. And in the case of Nazi Germany, you also see this heavy emphasis on the idea of eugenics, which is the idea of sort of purifying the race, purifying society, and getting rid of quote unquote undesirables. Now, so that's the definition. Those, if you see that, then you know that you're seeing fascism, right? What is fascism not? So oftentimes communist or socialist governments may be accused of being fascist. And it's certainly true that there may be elements of some of these systems, these government systems within these, within communist and socialist government systems. However, don't be fooled by that, because fascist governments absolutely despised communists and socialists, and they went out and aggressively tried to purge their society of these elements through the use of violence, through the use of restrictive laws. So this is not, these are not communist governments, these are not socialist governments. This is specifically fascism. And so fascism is a really interesting form of government in that you cannot really categorize it. But it certainly is a modern form of government that could occur again. It has a certain amount of appeal, particularly if a country has gone through some type of trauma. And that's why we see fascist governments really rise in the wake of World War I. So if you click on this video on the bottom, this will talk a little bit more about the definition of a fascist government. Okay, so now we are going to focus our attention on the rise of fascism in Italy. And we start in Italy because fascism and fascist government systems begin in Italy very quickly in the wake of World War I. Benito Mussolini, who you see pictured there, also known as El Duce, was the leader of this fascist movement in Italy after World War I. Benito Mussolini was the son of a blacksmith, and prior to his service in World War I, beginning in 1914, he was a member of the Socialist Party. But he parts with the Socialist Party during World War I because the Socialist Party remained a pacifist party during the First World War. And he decides that he is going to go serve in the war. So he serves in World War I. And he came back to Italy after World War I and saw a government that was not responding to the needs of the people. There was a collapsing economy. There was a widespread unemployment. There was a lot of social unrest, particularly in urban areas. And he was also dissatisfied with the fact that Italy had not gotten anything out of the Treaty of Versailles. Italy had wanted to get territorial acquisitions, particularly along its northern borders, in exchange for having served on the side of the Allies during World War I. And that was denied to them. So he decides that he is going to form a separatist kind of protest party, the Fascist Party. And the word fascist comes from the word fascio, which is spelled F-A-S-C-I-O, which is a term for a Roman axe. And this particular axe, the handle of the axe was a bundle of rods that was tied together. And so the idea behind fascism and the fascist party, as it was founded, and its root word, is that together you are stronger, stronger together. So that was the root of this idea of fascism. And Mussolini, feels like, the people of Italy need to unite. And he's very much disturbed, especially by the social unrest in these urban areas. So he creates this paramilitary group that goes out and disrupts things like labor protests or socialist or communist protests that might be happening on the streets of major cities. And they disrupt these protests. They also attack certain labor union headquarters and things like that. And they're technically illegal, but they're gaining in popularity. And then in 1922, Mussolini heads up this massive march on Rome, in Rome, and they're headed up by the black shirts. And basically, as he's going into Rome, the premier of Italy at the time gets very fearful, and the king of Italy, Emmanuel III, decides that he is going to appoint Mussolini as the premier to try to settle, to make the people happy, to try to settle down the protests. And so Mussolini gets appointed as the premier, which is like the president of Italy, in 1922. And he remains a popular figure throughout the 1920s. However, there was some issues with the Fascist Party and the Catholic Church. The Fascist Party didn't necessarily recognize the full legitimacy of the Catholic Church and wanted to have full political power. So in 1929, Mussolini and the Fascist Party signed a treaty with the Pope and the Catholic Church called the Lateran Treaty. And the Lateran Treaty is the treaty that creates the Vatican as a separate country within the city of Rome. So the Vatican, where the Pope lives, and where all of the major archives for the Catholic Church and everything are housed, is right there inside of the city of Rome. And with the Lateran Treaty being signed in 1929, that now becomes an independent country. When this happens, the Pope then decides to back Mussolini politically. And so the Pope comes out in 1929 supporting Mussolini and the Fascist Party. And once that happens, because a lot of Italians are deeply Catholic, once the Pope has supported Mussolini, then now he is going to gain widespread support, and more power will back the Fascist Party. So by the time you get into the 1930s in Italy, you have widespread support for the Fascist Party. At the same time that this is happening, the Fascist Party has been building up Italy's military, and with the intent of spreading and invading and taking over territories. And so they begin to do that in the early 1930s, and in 1936, they invade and take Ethiopia. And this was kind of a get back for the fact that Ethiopia had fought them back in the late 19th century when the Italians tried to take Ethiopia when the Europeans were busy, dividing up Africa. And so when this happens, the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, reaches out to the League of Nations for help, and unfortunately the League of Nations is unable to help Ethiopia fight back the Italians at this time. So here you see a map of the expansion of the Italian Empire, and you can see the extent of it in 1940. So it includes Albania. So let me get my laser pointer here. So it includes Albania, Libya here in North Africa, and Ethiopia over here. So the Italians have really expanded their influence. Okay, so now we're going to turn to talking about militarism and fascism in Japan. And we can kind of trace this back to the 1920s, to the ascendance of Emperor Hirohito in 1926 and the beginning of the Showa Restoration. The focus of the Showa Restoration was to basically build up Japan militarily, and also to set its sights on imperialist expansion into China. It had had its sights on this for quite some time. Japan had already invaded and successfully annexed the Korean peninsula by this point in time, and that happened in the early 1900s. But with the Showa restoration, you get a real focus on building up the military and advocating this idea of an invasion into China. And so in 1931, Japan crosses the Sea of Japan and invades an area known as Manchuria. So here's Japan, and this area of China right here is called Manchuria. And in 1931, Japan will invade this area and just kind of hang out there to see what will happen, to see what the world will do in reaction to their invasion. At the same time that they do this, they also drop out of the League of Nations. So they hang out there. Nobody seems to care or do anything about the fact that they have invaded and occupied this area. They actually changed the name of this province from Manchuria to Manchukuo, and they just stay there. And then, by the time we get to 1937, the Japanese decide that they want to take another bold move, and they continue an invasion into southern parts of China. And this will start the Sino-Japanese War, which begins in 1937 and essentially lasts till the end of World War II in 1945. So as I mentioned, there's this huge emphasis in Japan on building up military, but also on building up this idea of nationalism, of Japanese superiority, especially in the Asiatic regions. So if we look at this map, we can see the extent of the Japanese Empire prior on the eve of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So Korea had been annexed in 1910, as I already mentioned. So this is actually under Japanese control as well. But you can see here, this is the area that they invaded originally, Manchuria, and then they move into further south into other parts of China, down here to the Malay Peninsula. They take French Indonesia, which is Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam. And now they've set their sights on the Philippines, but remember the Philippines is technically a U.S. territory, so they know that they are going to have to deal with the U.S. if they try to take the Philippines, and that's where the plan begins to attack the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor. Okay, so moving on to probably talk about the most famous example of fascism, and that's Nazism in Germany. So Adolf Hitler was born in Austria and grew up as a young man who was kind of lost. He really wanted to be an artist, and prior to World War I, he had applied to art school on several occasions. And been rejected. And he was kind of, doing odd jobs and labor work. And then World War I broke out, and he found sort of this new purpose in his life. And he actually went and volunteered for the Austrian army in World War I and was rejected, and then went to Germany and applied for their military service and was accepted. So he fought for Germany during World War I, and he was actually wounded during the war. But when he comes back from World War I, he is this very passionate nationalist. He thinks that Germany has been slighted by the Treaty of Versailles, that it wasn't treated fairly, that the German people were made to suffer as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And he wants to see an end to the Weimar government, WEIMAR government. And the Weimar government is the government system that was put in place after World War I in Germany. And they're very Western friendly, but they're struggling financially because they're having to pay the war reparations, there's massive hyperinflation, etc. So he decides that he is going to join the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And there is a wing of that party that becomes really radicalized, and that's who will eventually become the Nazis. They decide that there's massive protests in the streets by this political party, and eventually they decide that they are going to try to orchestrate a coup against the Weimar government. And it's at that time that Hitler will be arrested and put in jail in 1923. When he's in jail, he writes his book called Mein Kampf, which translates into My Struggle. And essentially throughout the book, he talks about Germany's victimization after World War I. And he specifically is using the Jewish people in Mein Kampf as a scapegoat for all of Germany's sufferings. And he also talks quite a bit in there about building Germany back up, about the fact that that Germans are sort of the heir of this Aryan race, that somehow they are superior, etc., etc. So he writes this book in jail, and eventually gets released from jail. And at that point, he is going to form his own sort of paramilitary group similar to Mussolini's. Mussolini had the black shirts, and Hitler will form the brown shirts. And they go around and they do very similar kind of actions that the black shirts did in Italy. They disrupt labor union headquarters, they disrupt any kind of protests that were happening in the streets. And slowly but surely, the Nazi Party begins to grow. But they didn't have a significant majority in the Reichstag, which is the German parliament. They remained a minority until the Great Depression breaks out. And when the Great Depression breaks out, the number of Nazis voted into the Reichstag will rise significantly. They'll rise from just 12 members of the German parliament to 107 members. So they are very quickly going to gain a majority in the parliament. And the reason for this is because the Nazis had a clear plan for mitigating the impact of the Great Depression. And they had a bunch of social programs and things that were very appealing to the German people at the time. The German people liked the Nazis' message. They liked the idea that somehow they had been victimized by the circumstances surrounding World War I, that somehow the Weimar government was ineffective in responding to the needs of the German people. And of course, many of the German people, the message that they were somehow special or superior to others also was appealing in this time of trouble. So as the Nazi Party gains power in the Reichstag, Hitler will eventually be voted in as chancellor, and this happens in 1933. And he creates, one of his first actions as chancellor is to create a ministry of public enlightenment and propaganda. And this particular ministry's job was to basically take the Nazi ideology and propagate it to the German people. They also were in charge of things like banning certain types of books, massive, widespread censorship, etc. So Hitler is the Chancellor of the Reichstag, which is basically like the Speaker of the House. And so he's setting the agenda. He is basically setting the mood for the discussions within the German parliament. And he has some enemies, and these enemies decide that they are going to attack the Reichstag building by setting it on fire. So there's an arson attack on the Reichstag. And when this happens, Hitler uses this as a reason to pass an act that will essentially give him the power to rule by decree, to basically rule as a dictator for 4 years, okay? So he's asking the parliament, he says, look, we have enemies out there. I want to be able to have the power to rule as a dictator so that we don't have to be hung up on all these parliamentary procedures, et cetera, et cetera. So he gets it. He actually gets the votes necessary to pass the Enabling Act. And when this happens, he uses this opportunity to consolidate his power. And what he does is he goes out and does a massive blood purge of his own party. He has people within his Nazi party that he suspects as being treasonous. And so he goes out and he basically either has them killed or forcefully exiles them, in some cases puts them in prison. And so there's this massive sort of cleansing of the Reichstag until basically all you have left are people who are loyal to Hitler and the Nazi party. And then after that happens in 1933, in 1934, the president of Germany, because Hitler's just basically the Speaker of the House, the Chancellor of the Reichstag, but there's also a president, President Hindenburg. He dies in 1934. And when that happens, Hitler uses that opportunity to take total control of the country and become the Führer, the ultimate leader. And so at this particular time, the Nazi Party seems as if it is unstoppable. It has widespread support by the German people. Basically, the entire Reichstag has been converted into a Nazi political body. And so they set out to pass a bunch of laws doing things like forbidding labor unions. So in 1934, labor unions are completely abolished throughout the country of Germany. They also get to work at trying to mitigate the circumstances around the Great Depression. So they start a mix of social programs and free enterprise and free business programs. They encourage trade with other countries and the buildup of manufactured goods within Germany. Also the growing of foodstuffs and raw materials. And so as the Nazi Party is becoming effective at mitigating the circumstances around the Great Depression, at the same time, they are also beginning to control society by passing laws and banning books and putting censorship on the media so that basically the German people are only hearing Nazi propaganda. Okay, so here we see some examples of the ultranationalism of the Nazi government. This is a photograph of the Hitler Youth program that put in place in Nazi Germany as a way to indoctrinate the youth of Germany into this fascist ideology, specifically this idea of racial superiority. The really sad thing about this is that for many of these young kids, by the time World War I starts, they had already been through the Hitler Youth program. So some of the young soldiers that were fighting in World War II for the Nazis had actually already been brainwashed through this program and essentially had become indoctrinated into this ideology. So as we talked about at the beginning of the lecture, and also if you clicked on the video, you would have heard about how a big part of the program for the Nazis was this promotion of the propagation of the Aryan race. And in order to kind of incentivize that, the Nazis put in these special prizes for Aryan women that would have a certain amount of children. So you can see here, these are something called the Mother's Cross that was awarded every year in Germany on Hitler's mother's birthday, August 12th, to women that had had a certain amount of children. So you'll notice that to get the Bronze Cross, you have 4 to 5 children, silver 6 to 7 children, and gold 8 or more children. Again, this idea of building up this massive Aryan nation. As you also heard on the video, this was only true for what was considered quote-unquote Aryan mothers. If you were anybody else, you were encouraged to have an abortion if you got pregnant. So again, this is to promote these ideas, these eugenic ideas that the Nazi Party promoted. Okay, so now we're going to turn to talking about some of the really darker aspects of the Nazi ideology, and this is specifically the idea that Jewish people were somehow enemies of the state. What you're seeing here is a cartoon, a Nazi cartoon, that shows a Jewish person who is stabbing a German soldier in the back. And this goes to a false theory called the stab in the back theory. And this was really promoted by Hitler as a way to get the German people to hate Jewish people. So the idea goes that there was somehow a conspiracy during World War I to thwart the German efforts by the Jewish community. And it goes that there were Jewish bankers who were funding the arms supply chains during World War I, and that the Jewish bankers were convinced by the Allies to stop funding the supply chain for the Germans, thereby making weapons unavailable to the German military towards the end of the war. And this idea of a stab in the back goes back to this idea, this notion that somehow Germany was welcoming to Jewish people, and that during the war, Jewish people tried to undermine the efforts of the German military. So that was sort of the lie that was told over and over again, and it was a way to get popular support for the anti-Semitism that was rampant during the Nazi reign. Okay, so considering the fact that both Hitler and Mussolini seem to have a lot in common, it's really no surprise that they create an alliance known as the Axis Alliance, and this will be created in November of 1936. Hitler really looked up to Mussolini, and in fact, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of his programs were kind of modeled after what Mussolini had done in Italy in the 1920s. So when this happens in 1936, both Italy and Germany will withdraw from the League of Nations. So the U.S. response to all of this growing fascist threat in Europe is essentially to remain neutral and isolationist. Remember that after World War I, the Americans really were committed to this idea of international peace and not wanting to get involved in other countries' affairs. And so throughout the 1930s, we see examples of the United States sort of refusing to get involved in other countries' affairs. A very clear example of this is the Spanish Civil War, which breaks out in 1936, where you have this leader, Francisco Franco, essentially a fascist leader, trying to overthrow the nationalist government in Spain. And the United States knew that it was happening. They knew that there were war crimes being committed against the Spanish people, They knew that Franco was a monster, essentially, but they refused to get involved. There was a small group of U.S. Volunteer military that went over there called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and that was about 2,500 American soldiers that went over there to volunteer and fight against Franco. But besides that, there was a overall policy, official policy of refusal to get involved in the Spanish War, Spanish Civil War. The other thing that happened after World War I was this investigation into the link between banking and arms manufacturing and dealing. And the question that came before the Nye Committee in 1933 was, do certain people profit from war? And I think the obvious answer to anybody that thinks about that for a second is yes, of course, there will be people that profit from war. And that was the exact findings of this congressional committee in 1933. And the end result of that is that the American people are kind of shocked and put off by this idea that yes, indeed, there could be people that benefit from war. And of course, most educated Americans realize that this is very dangerous, because if there are certain people that benefit from war, then there could be certain people who want to promote war. So the Nye Committee, the refusal to take sides in the Spanish Civil War, but as things start to heat up in Europe, when it comes to the buildup of the Nazi Party, and of course the growing aggression by the Italians and the expansion of territory by the Italians, the United States felt the need to pass some acts of Congress to clarify our position, and these are known as the Neutrality Acts. There are two of them, one in 1935 and one in 1937. The first one in 1935 just very simply prohibited making loans and selling arms to nations at war. So if you were at war, the United States was not going to sell you weapons, and we were not going to give you loans. The second Neutrality Act, passed in 1937, was something called the cash and carry. And this was basically where nations would have to pay in cash for any kind of non-military goods and transport those goods in their own ships. So if you were a nation at war, this was specific for nations at war, you would have to pay cash for items, and you would have to carry them away on your own ships. And this was in an effort to try to get the United States merchants or anybody out of harm's way. This was also a way to ensure that the United States was not giving loans to or somehow funding any kind of war effort. Okay, so as the United States is choosing to remain neutral, the Nazis decide to put forward their plan to expand their territories in Europe. And the first target of Nazi expansion is going to be the areas that were taken from Germany as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So in 1936, Hitler moves his troops into the Rhineland, which is an area, border area between Germany and France. This is an area that is traditionally German-speaking. It had once been part of Germany. So he takes his troops, moves them into this area, and occupies this region. That's in 1936. Nobody responds at first. 1938, he moves into Austria, which of course is the country south of Germany, and basically moves troops in there, occupies. There's very little to no resistance in Austria. 1938 also, he moves into the Sudetenland, which is another border region, an area bordering Germany and Czechoslovakia. When he does this, he has now violated directly, really, the Treaty of Versailles and the sovereign nation of Czechoslovakia, which was one of those nations that was created as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, all those geopolitical settlements that came out of that treaty. So when this happens, the other European nations realize that they have to respond to this. And so both England and France send their prime ministers to meet with Hitler and Mussolini in a conference in Munich. And what comes out of this is known as the Munich Pact. And it also is called the policy of appeasement, right? So appeasement is the idea that you are going to give somebody something, they don't make a fuss, right? In order that there isn't like some kind of disruption. I always like to think of the analogy of my kids, when they were little and they wanted something at the checkout line, maybe a piece of candy, and I didn't want to buy it for them, but they threw a fit, and in order to appease them, in order to quiet them down, I would often give in, so that's appeasement. And so this policy of appeasement that the England and France carry out with Nazi Germany in September of 1938 will really become, in many ways, almost a political stain on the careers of those prime ministers. But they had reasons for this policy of appeasement, and the three main reasons are listed here. Number one, they didn't want to stop Germany because they wanted to avoid war. So the Munich Pact and the policy of appeasement, basically the pact said this. It said, Germany said, I will stop expanding at this point, right? We've taken everything that we want. Hitler said, we got the Rhineland, we got the Sudetenland, we got Austria, and now we're satisfied, right? So he's basically lying to try to get them to agree to this, okay? But the reason why the Allies believed him is because they wanted to believe him, and they wanted to believe him for these three reasons. Number one, they wanted to avoid war. Number two, a lot of these countries had business ties with the Nazi government. This was true for England, France, and also for the United States at this time. Number three, the Western European countries actually believed that Hitler was a better option to Stalin. They preferred Hitler over Stalin, and so they figured Hitler would create this buffer zone between Western Europe and the Soviet Union. And so they figured, well, if we could pick the lesser of two evils, we'll choose Hitler over Stalin. So for those three reasons, France and England agreed to the Munich Pact, carried out this policy of appeasement. However, ultimately, that policy of appeasement is going to fail. And that's because, of course, Hitler was not intending on stopping at just the Sudetenland, the Rhineland, and Austria. He had his eyes set on Poland and the rest of Czechoslovakia. So in 1939, Hitler will take the rest of Czechoslovakia, and then he starts to set his sights on Poland. Now, Poland is a country that borders both Germany and the Soviet Union. And so Hitler knew that if he invaded Poland, he could very well start a war with the Soviet Union. He didn't want that. So instead, he decides that he is going to co-opt the Soviet Union into creating a of mutual aggression. So basically that they will both co-invade Poland. Now, Poland was one of those countries that was created as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So these, both Germany and the Soviet Union had an interest in recovering some of that territory for themselves. And so they create in August of 1939 something called the Nazi-Soviet Pact. And this pact basically says that they agree to this non-aggression between the two nations and that they will co-invade the country of Poland. So on September 1st, 1939, World War II begins. with the invasion by Germany into Poland, and just 2 weeks later, an invasion into Poland by Russia. Poland is going to fall within just a few weeks' time, especially because you have these two major armies invading it from both sides. Britain and France will enter the war because obviously the Munich Pact has broken down. The policy of appeasement is not going to work. Newsflash, Hitler lies. So basically, Britain and France are forced to get into this conflict. Germany then, because it has a pact with the Soviet Union at the time, is going to turn its full attention and its full military might on Western Europe. And they will carry out a military campaign known as Blitzkrieg, also translated into lightning war. Basically, the strategy here is to do heavy artillery assaults on a region, either through bombing or through long-range artillery shelling of a region, basically blowing it apart and then moving a troop force in. And the Nazi troop force was known as the stormtroopers. Those were the first line of troops to go into an area after it had been bombarded, and then take that area. And they would do this over and over and over again. And this military strategy, this Blitzkrieg, will allow the German army to take Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, little old Luxembourg, and France by June of 1940. So in just a short period of time, about 9 months period of time, Germany will essentially have taken over all of Western Europe, with the exception of England. And England is basically stuck on its own, on an island, trapped, trying to fight back this massive German war machine. So if we look at this map, we can see the way that this co-invasion was carried out. Germany invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939. Again, you can see Poland is being invaded from the west, and then the Soviet Union moving into Poland in September, mid-September, also of 1939. So Poland basically just simply did not have a chance here. And once that is complete, Germany will move into these other regions of Western Europe, successfully taking France by June of 1940. And this is, of course, when there was this massive evacuation of French and English soldiers right here at Dunkirk. They made a movie about it recently, where there had to be an evacuation that was facilitated by civilians as well, because there wasn't enough military to ferry people out of France over to England. So at this particular time, England is really sort of stuck here on its own while Germany takes over all of this region here. Italy, of course, is a German ally, and Switzerland remaining neutral throughout the war. Also down here in Spain, which was basically being run by Franco at this point, is also going to remain neutral. So what is the U.S. response to this? Well, it was very divided. Some people felt very upset by this immediately and wanted the United States to get involved in the war and to go out help their British allies. On the other hand, there was a huge outcry that we did not want to get involved in another war, another European war, and so there was a debate happening back and forth. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's the president still, is kind of more on the side of going to war. So he is going to implement domestically all measures short of war. So he will act Service Training and Service Act in 1940, This will build up the U.S. ground forces. And you also see with a significant amount of pressure from the FDR administration, the Congress passing the Lend-Lease Act, and this will be passed in January of 1941. And this basically null and voids the cash and carry, because remember the Cash and Carry Act, which were part of the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, of 1937 specifically, required that all nations at war pay cash for everything and then come and get it themselves. Well, this will basically void that act and instead allows for Britain in particular to obtain arms from the United States with the promise to pay after the war. So this is basically giving England a blank check saying, here you go, take whatever you need and don't worry about paying it back until after the war. And then also there's some naval skirmishes that are going to be taking place between some American vessels and some German vessels in the North Atlantic. So that by the time fall of 1941 comes along, FDR is basically convinced that the United States will inevitably get into this war. It just was, how was that going to happen? And so that's what we're going to talk about in the next lecture. We're going to move to talking about how the nation actually gets involved in World War II, and of course, beginning with the bombing and the attack on Pearl Harbor. All right, guys, have a good one, and I will see you later.